So thank you very much for coming to this event. So today we're going to be talking about women in science, and I'll start very briefly with a short introduction to introduce the questions, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion and finally open to the Q&A. And so I'm Nora, I'm a postdoc here at the Institut Jean-Nicot, and co-organizers Naomi and C work at the LSEP. And so we decided to try to organize this panel in order to try to have a more informed discussion about these questions of women in science. So we noticed that we were having discussions, but there didn't seem to be very organized ways and venues to discuss these issues. So we thought we'd create one. And also because we think it's important to try to learn from each other's experiences of what the various people actually experience to be issues, and trying to figure out, to acknowledge on the one hand, and also see how we can deal with the implicit biases that we all bring to the table, and figure out how we can improve, both at the institutional and at a personal level, to create a more friendly environment as the scientific community. So one of the first issues here is the one of representation. So in many studies show that women tend to be less well represented in higher education and in other levels, especially within science, technology, engineering, and maths. So at the OECD average, so a group of European countries as well as some other countries, women are about 38%, and this is a similar percentage in France. So that means that there's less than half of the people who are women. And even more striking than the question of whether there are women at higher education levels is the issue of the glass ceiling. So even when women might be well represented at university levels, then their proportion of women to men tends to decrease as the career progresses. So there's less and less from doctorates, doctorates that are funded, and researchers. And this is data from the Cnrs. And at the European level, and in particular in science and engineering, this problem is even more striking, as you can see here. So at the bachelor's level, there's already inequalities, but these inequalities increase quite dramatically as people progress to postdoc, to PI, and professor status. And a very flagrant example of the lack of representation of women, for example, in boards and committees, is the very recent appointment in March of 2018 of the INR governing board, where only 1/3 of the members across several groups of representatives are women. And within the representatives of the major scientific fields, there are 6 men listed as the representatives and 6 women listed as substitutes. And so this speaks to also the problem of invisibility. Even when women might be present at university and so on, they might be less visible because they might be less likely to be invited for conferences, for colloquia, and that can be across disciplines, not specifically in science. And women might be less likely to speak up or ask questions, for example, in classes or in conferences. And this related issue to questions of self-confidence, that men might tend to be overconfident, and here a study of physiology or biology undergrads, for example, show that the average man thinks he's smarter than 66% of his class, whereas women seem to be about right, about 54%. And linked to this is, of course, the well-known imposter syndrome of people feeling like they might not deserve their place, or they might not know enough to be considered experts. And another question is then, in terms of publications or output, whether there are also inequalities in the output from women and men. And again, looking at the EU average and across disciplines, women who are identified as corresponding authors tend to represent only 31% of publications, and this is data around 2013. And so women representing 31% of publications mean they produce about half of what men produce. And this is less than their actual proportion in academia. And these inequalities are even larger, again, within science and technology. And although women might publish less, they have been found to perhaps be more readable. So, for example, a study in the field of economics found that publications by women tend to get more scrutiny by the editors. And so peer reviews might take about 6 months longer, but in the end, the papers are actually more readable. And another recent study also showed that women who have women as supervisors tend to actually produce more papers and are 50% more likely to become academics, showing that the supportive environment really makes a difference. Of course, another well-known issue is that of parenthood, because even though both men and women are parents, women tend to have more load of caretaking. So our expectations of parents for men and women are different, and women are expected to be the main caretakers, while at the same time not letting that influence their career. And men often actually struggle with the expectations that the career should be number one. And a very recent example from a professor of biology, he posted this on Twitter about two married colleagues who bring their kids to university, and they're in the student evaluations. One gets called unprofessional and the other one as a great parent. You can imagine who. So many problems, many of these problems affect parents in academia. So more and more mobility across countries is a very important thing in progressing in moving jobs. But that can be very difficult for parents because they have to leave their support network, and they can also struggle with traveling to conferences, again, related to this mobility, or even networking, again, because of schedules and caretaking. And although this applies, again, both to men and women, it might affect women more. Another question which is related here is the issue of mental health in academia. So more and more people are becoming aware that in academia there tends to be a pretty high prevalence of mental health problems, namely depression and anxiety. So this is data from a recent survey showing around 40% of PhD students suffering from anxiety and depression. But this affects women more and even more transgender people. So finally, of course, it's important to think about what we can do moving forward to deal with these various issues. And so here we've listed just a few helpful, a few strategies that have been shown to be helpful, like, for example, adapting hiring procedures and promotion procedures, like having diversity and equality task forces that are particularly geared at trying to reduce inequalities, like the Cnrs has this mission for the place of women, or here at ENS and many universities have a référent de parité, which is another person at the university who's trying to help promote equality. And things like adapting procedures, like having more structured interviews can help. Adapting peer review procedures so that they are blind to people's gender. And so, for example, the curtain test was used in orchestras so that people wouldn't see the gender of the performer, and this was shown to really make a big difference. Of course, mentorship programs have been shown to be very effective, so providing support to people makes a big difference. And of course, one needs to consider specific needs of parents, like the timings of colloquia and seminars. Like lunchtime things might be more practical for some, and as well as flexibility in scheduling events is quite important, because sometimes it's hard to know exactly what's going to happen in the future, and sometimes maybe different degrees of uncertainty that women and men might feel, again, because of different responsibilities we're caretaking, might make a difference here. So, We've listed here a bunch of resources, so organizations focus on promoting the place of women, and as well as prizes like the L'Oréal Prize, and for example, Our Ladies, which is focused on women who program in R. And you can find these slides online. We'll post them on the Deck Life website, and then you can find all the links. We'll now move on to the panel discussion. Yes, and also just to note here that, yeah, although we can't see very clearly, we have an email, which is womenInscienceDeck@gmail.com. And if you're interested in becoming involved in this for the future, to making more events like this and seeing how we can move forward, please get in touch. And so now we'll pass on to Naomi.
Hi. So I'll shortly present the panelists, the speakers. I will not say much because I think each one of them will also tell a bit about their background, but just so you know who they are. Aude is a PhD student in chemistry, and she's studying in the ENS and in the Polytechnique. She has experience working both in the academia as well as an entrepreneur. She co-founded L'Hôpital, which is a mouvement d'innovation, sorry for my French, collaboratif pour améliorer l'expérience patient, so for patients in hospitals. Additionally, she's a laureate of the prestigious L'Oréal Unesco Prize for Women that was mentioned here in science, and she's an ambassador for women. Lucie, who is sitting here, is a postdoc in cognitive neuroscience at the University College London, and she was a student here in her PhD. She completed the PhD in neurospin. And when she was doing her PhD, she was working in Femmes et sciences. So she has experience working both here in France and in the UK. And Anne, I think you all know, is the director of the LSEP. She also supervised many students, and she has experience serving at various review boards and committees. So she knows a bit about what's happening behind the scenes. So I'll let Aude talk for 10 minutes and tell us a bit.
Hi everyone. So first I would just like to thank you for inviting me today to speak about women in science. I'm very honored and very happy to be able to have this conversation today. So I am 25 years old, and I am a PhD student in chemistry. Before my PhD, I went to class préparatoire and engineering school, which is a place where women are even more invisible than here, I guess. And then, yeah, I began my PhD in chemistry, which is a bit more feminized field than engineering, I guess. And last year, I got the L'Oréal Unesco Prize for Women in Science. And I was really, really honored to get it. But most importantly, I got an opportunity to raise my voice. And then I really became an advocate for girls in science, especially like high school girls wondering what they want to do later, and trying to convince them that science is a good option and it's not that hard and it's possible for them. And so, yeah, I took part in different actions around this, and I want to talk to you about why those girls are so much hesitating, and what can we do about it? So, sorry, I'm just gonna get to my slides. Yeah, it's also my slides. So, I think the first problem is self-confidence. So, yeah, sorry, I want to tell you that I'm going to talk to you about my experience, and also about what I heard when I met some girls in high schools and middle schools, because with the L'Oréal for Girl in Science program, now I go to those schools to have this conversation, and also I do some shows in la Cité des Sciences with also a lot of students. And also what I'm going to talk about is what I think about it, how I myself lived it, and how girls talk about it when I meet them. So it's only like opinions. Please, it's not, I don't know if it's the truth, but it's what I think about it. So yeah, I think the first problem is self-confidence. And I'm going to talk about my experience. So when I was a child, this is how I pictured myself growing up. Like a very badass scientist woman. I don't know if you recognize, but it's taken from the Hidden Figures movie. So when I was like 15, I told my math professor that later I'm going to be like a very badass scientist, and so that's why I'm going to go to a classe préparatoire in Paris. So you have to know I was in the north of France in a very small village, and this is how my teacher pictured myself in classe préparatoire. You're going to cry all the time. It's going to be so hard for you. I mean, do you know how much pressure it's going to put on your shoulders? Like, you don't want to do that. I mean, you're going to have to work all the time. People are going to be mean to you. How can you live with this? So then you're left with this impression, I'm not strong enough. Because as a woman, you're supposed to be very sensitive, very fragile, and so you're not strong enough to go to very hard fields like math or chemistry or physics, because those are very, very hard. So this is how I felt, but I finally overcome it, and I'm really happy that I did. But what I hear even more often when I go to the schools is not I'm not strong enough, it's I'm not good enough, which is even worse, I think. So when I ask girls, okay, who here wants to go to, I don't know, math or chemistry or like STEM university? Maybe half of them don't raise their hands. And then when I ask them, okay, so why? Maybe you want to do literature or something, it's okay. They just say, no, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough in math in particular. I want to cite one experience that's been done in Toulouse by two French professors. So they took a panel of very small children, like I think 11 or 12 years old, and they gave them an exercise. And so they really randomly chose the children. And to half of them, they gave a geometry exercise. And to the other half, they gave a drawing exercise. Actually, it was exactly the same exercise. But in the first one, boys had better results. And in the second one, girls had better results, just because they thought it was not math. So it really shows how bad those impressions that we have about ourselves, our lack of self-confidence can influence our results. And I think it's not just about how we feel, it's also how people make us feel. And I think teachers and families have a huge impact also. So now I'm going to cite another experience. I guess you know it better than me because I'm not a cognitive science student actually. So it's the Rosenthal effect. So in the US, they did a huge experience on some classes where they took the students and they made an IQ test. And then they went to the teachers and they said, okay, this child, they're all going to be late bloomers. And probably this year, they're going to have very, very good results. Well, obviously, they just took random children that didn't have better results in the IQ test. But then what happens is that at the end of the year, those so-called bloomers have better results. And what we understand is that the teacher pays more attention to those children because they're supposed to be good. So when they ask a question, they always answer. When they look like they are not well, the teacher is going to take more time to spend it with them. I mean, your attitude changes because of your expectations. So it also works for ourselves. It's called self-fulfilling prophecies. So if we think we're going to fail, then we fail. And obviously, women tend to think that they're going to fail. Another thing I want to talk about is lack of representation. Because when I was like 8 years old, and I was looking on the TV, or even if you go to a conference or whatever, you always see 40 or 50 years old white men talking. I just did a very small experiment yesterday night. I went on Google and I wrote French black women scientist. So this is what I found. So on the first line, you see black actors. Then you see white scientists. Then you see the movie I was talking about, the Hidden Figures, which is American. The only black scientist you see here is Mary Jackson from the NASA. Here. And the others, she's not French, obviously, she's American. The other pictures are Hedy Lamarr, which is, okay, I really admire her, but she's white. Well, so, you know what I'm wondering, am I a weirdo? I mean, where are people like me? Where are they? I mean, am I supposed to be a scientist, or am I supposed to, I don't know, clean the toilets? Well, people like me, even in the movies, I don't see them. I think it's a huge problem. I think representation really is a key. If you want to project yourself in a new environment, you need to have role models that look like you. And the question that comes with it is lack of information. Because when I was 15 and thinking about science, actually, I had no clue what was going on in the lab. I had no clue. Because my mom is a nurse, my dad is a accountant, and well, you see, it looked nice, but actually you don't know what people were doing with their weird white coats and stuff. And so now I'm going to show you stuff that was from the interventions I do in class. So when I go to a middle school class and I ask the students, what do you think science is about? It's all about. Oh, what's going on here? Okay. Then, sorry. This is what they say. They say it's very, very long studying. They say white coat. They say glasses. They say no knowledge, experiments. And they also say Einstein, very serious. Sorry, what's going on? All right. And math and, you know, boring stuff. Actually, when I did these experiments, they already know I'm a scientist, so they're nice. But when we also do the shows in Cité des Sciences, when we arrive, we just say, we're gonna, you know, have a show today, and so here are the intervenants. And they don't know we are scientists, so they're really, really worse than that. They say, like, ugly people, boring people, stuff like that. Actually, they have no clue what's going on. And the last thing is fear of failure. Because actually, I think for girls, it's even worse. Like, if you have a very bad grade, this is how you really look like, right? and you really think that if you fail, it's going to be the end of the world. And so you will choose something that looks easier, because really you cannot fail. Like, it's worse than dying. Okay, so what can we do, and what do I do right now? So this is a picture of all the girls that got the L'Oréal scholarship last year. We were 30. And I think the most important part of this L'Oréal scholarship is that we are visible. We are on the magazines, even on TV, on the radio. So first, you know, I was really afraid, like, what I'm going to say on TV, I'm going to be ridiculous, I feel so uncomfortable. And then I realized that I really have to speak up, because representation is key. Because when I was 8 years old and I opened up the TV, I would be so, so happy to see a woman like me on TV doing what I want to do. It would be so important for me. And the other thing is empower girls, because they need the role models and they need the sorority. So here is a picture of the shows that we do in Cité des Sciences. And here is a part of the presentation that I give when I go in class. I just want to show them that we are normal, you know, because they think that women in science are like kind of aliens or something. Like this, they're really weird, and we don't see them like really like aliens. We're not sure they even exist. And so I want to show them that we are normal, we are funny. When we are in the lab, we actually like it. We are not forced to go there. We are not slaves. We are not, like, you know, it's not that boring and that awful. And then, if you want them to project themselves, I think the role model is not enough. They also want to know what's going on inside. So you can describe it, but the best thing you can do is show them. Yeah. Yeah, so this is an internship that I organized with the Paris Montagne Association. So as a PhD student, you can all volunteer for that if you want. It's not only for girls, it's for all the students in high school that are interested in science but have no clue what's going on in the lab. And they want to spend 1 week of their holidays with you just to discover your life. And I think this is really huge. I did it twice, and each time I got 2 girls. And one of the girls that came to my lab 2 years ago sent me an email like 2 months ago saying, hey, right now I'm doing my bachelor's in chemistry and I'm looking for an internship. Can you help me? And I almost cried when I read that, because when she came to my lab, she was like, well, you know, I didn't know what to do during my holidays, and so they said it was cool, so I came here. She didn't really assume that she liked science. She was like, you know, I came. And right now she's doing a bachelor's. And actually she's doing her internship in my lab, which is really, really cool. But yeah, so if you want to project yourself in a place, then you need to know what this place is. You need to try to spend some time there, and you need to meet the people who work there and realize that they are like you. So yeah, you have to let them try. But also, so I was talking about trying like just for 1 week during the holidays. But I think they also have to try for real. And we have to send the message that failure is okay. And that if they want to try with science and it doesn't work, well, it's okay. But at least they will know that it's not for them. So this is a very common image. But when you're a child and you're learning to walk, then you just fall down all the time. And it's totally fine. So why is it not like this for studies? I mean, in France, when you took the wrong decision and you're in the wrong university and you lose a year, it's like the worst thing that can happen to you when you're 20 years old. Why is that? I mean, it's just 1 year and you never lose a year. You just learn some stuff and learn to know yourself. So I would really like to send this message that failure is totally fine. So just to conclude, why is this so important for me and for you and for all of us? Well, it's a very, very easy answer. We need more brains. All of us here are scientists. You are trying to tackling huge questions like health, like environment, like things that are really, really hard to understand and we really need to make progress on. So why do we skip on like half of humanity? Why don't we use those brains that are actually working well? Well, I think it's quite a shame. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was amazing. So I invite Lucie.
Okay, so yes, I also wanted to thank the organizer for organizing this event today. So the reason I was invited to talk here is that I actually studied here in the ENS, but I'm now working in the UK. And so the thing I want to talk to you about today is a bit my impressions of the UK compared to France. And I have to start with a disclaimer. So this is very much my experience and not my expertise. So as a scientist, I have expertise in cognitive neuroscience, but not so much in this question of women in science. So I'm just going to talk really on the first person basis today. And just to give you an idea, so I studied in France, as I was saying, here in the ENS. I also did an internship here in the LSCP a few years ago. I then conducted my PhD in Neurospin, which was INSEM CEA research unit. And I started to really be interested in this question of women in science during that time, because I had the great opportunity to work with, so instead of doing teaching in complementary of my research work, I decided to do a democratization of science mission in the UPMC, so in the University Pierre Marie Curie, and I worked with the association Women in Science and organized these events very much like what Aude was describing. So it was something called 1000 ambassadrices pour la science, so 1,000 ambassadors for science. And the idea of these events was to bring to high schools women scientists, so engineers, professors, researchers, and to talk to very young people about science, both to encourage them to do science, to pursue a career in science, but as well just to kind of break the stereotypes of what women scientists can look like. And after that, I moved to the UK for my postdoc, and I worked at Oxford University in the Department of Experimental Psychology. And there I also joined an association that kind of do things for women in science, Oxfest, which is the association of women in STEM in Oxford University, in which it was much more related to academia and kind of the private sector, so less of a young audience. And then more recently I joined UCL in London. So so that's kind of my experience with the institutions that I worked in as a woman scientist. And I just want to talk about the kind of differences I noticed between the two countries, so between France and the UK, and I don't want to make it a match and a competition between France and the UK, but I just want to emphasize some of the things that I noticed that I find are quite interesting. So the first one is on the question of women in science. I find that in the UK, the institutions care much more about this problem than in France. And I'll just start with one example, which is the Athena Swan Charter. So what's the Athena Swan Charter? So it's a charter that was launched in 2005 by the Equality Challenge Unit. So it's a British charity. And the idea is simply to kind of establish a number of principles to kind of that institutions such as universities have to adhere to kind of promote the question, promote women in science. And the idea is that it gives to institution a kind of a label of excellence in terms of what they are doing for women in science. So typically, institutions apply to be members of the Athena Swan Charter, or to the principle of the charter, and then they can have awards. So if you want, it's a kind of they have gradings in terms of the quality of what they are doing for women in science. And now 143 universities around the UK adhere to that charter, and departments can also individually apply to that charter, and so now they have nearly 700 awards with different kind of level of gradings. So what are the kind of things that are done within this program? So the idea is that to apply, to get the award, the university has to prove that they are doing things for women in science and to promote this kind of career for women. So an event like today, for example, would count as part of this. But other things that I think Nuha mentioned already are things like installing a mentoring program. So, for example, here in the Psychology and Language Sciences department that I'm part of, you have at least 2 mentoring programs. One that is online, and this is specially advertised to women, and both for women to be mentors and for women to be mentees. You have things such as networking groups. So in UCL, you have 2 women networking group. You have lots of talks about role models, women being role models for other young women scientists. And just to give you an idea of how this is present for us, so this is examples. This is very small, but this is examples of emails that I received just yesterday, actually. So just yesterday, I received an email saying, okay, so this kind of equality and diversity program is just organizing talks about the career of women this particular woman. There is also a series of lectures in women in psychological science. So all this is very available, and you all the time have these kind of things reminding you of the possibilities, and that other women are actually doing this kind of work. So that's the first thing. The second big difference, and I think Nuha did mention that at the beginning, is that there is in the UK much more data available about what the situation is for women in science and for women in general in the workplace. So a good example is the UCL, the gender pay gap, which you can have for UCL, but actually you can have for any companies in the UK. So it was a law that was voted in 2010 that any company has to provide statistics on the gender pay gap in their company, and this is true also for universities. So you can search online for any company and you'll have these statistics available. And so I don't know if you can see that very well, but these statistics are also available for all universities. So I just showed you here the stats for UCL, Oxford and Cambridge. So you can see that UCL is doing a bit better, especially than Oxford, but still there's quite a lot to be done there. The point is, all these stats are very, very, very easily accessible, and then it makes the problem so visible in a way that anyone understands that it needs to be resolved. So this is for example, the statistics in the Psychology and Language Sciences department, that if you, after 2 clicks on the internet, you can find these numbers very easily. So because the data are here and is available, it makes it much easier to kind of understand that there's a problem there. Finally, the last difference I kind of notice is there is also kind of a very much stronger recognition of the problems that women can face in their career in general, so in the workplace, and in particular in science. And I'll just take one example of sexual harassment. So when you arrive in the UK and when you start to work in the university, probably you'll have an induction. In that induction, the question of sexual harassment is going to be mentioned from the start. So you know exactly what you are accounted for, both as men and women. And there are strict guidelines on this kind of questions. There is also a lot of resources online. So if you type UCL sexual harassment, almost all departments have resources online telling you what to do if you feel that you're a victim of sexual harassment, if you feel that you witness sexual harassment. The student union, for example, in UCL, positioned themselves very strongly on this question and are taking a lot of initiatives. And to give you a very concrete example, again, so you can't see anything here, sorry about that, but a very concrete example of how this is tackled. So I know that we are in this post-Weinstein era, but in the UK, around Christmas time, you have a lot of Christmas parties. And in December, we received this email from the head of the department saying, please do enjoy the Christmas party, have a great time, have great holidays and everything. But these are kind of the guidelines and the policy of UCL on the question of behavior and sexual harassment. And this gave just a reminder for everyone to behave in a respectful way, even if there is alcohol involved, but also just to give direct information on what to do if you feel that you're a victim of sexual harassment. And so that's an email that I got in December just this year. So I looked a bit on what was available for this in France. So, for example, Université Pierre et Marie Curie is quite the same size as UCL. And I looked, if you type harcèlement sexuel UPMC, you don't find anything. The only thing that you find is actually a case made by the CGT, so the union, about a woman who was actually left her job because of a case of sexual harassment, and she's now defended by the union. I have to say that, Université Paris-Saclay has a bit more stuff available. But this is a kind of concrete example of a problem that some women can face and can have very detrimental consequences on their career, and for which at least the UK has really clear tools to set in place to tackle. Okay, so overall, how is it to be a female scientist in the UK compared to France? So exactly as I said before, overall, I'd say you feel much more supported by the institution that you're in. So there's a stronger kind of sense of work ethics, I would say, a stronger awareness of the problems that are encountered by women in science, and there is a real willingness to tackle this issue. Now, I have to say, this is very true in UCL, which is a big university and is also very international. I had to say that universities such as Oxford and Cambridge are much more conservative, and I don't know if they are as kind of up-to-date on this question than bigger universities. The second thing is that there are some differences in terms of gender stereotype and cultural differences. So the kind of machismo that you still encounter in France, in just day-to-day behavior, that doesn't correspond to sexual harassment or anything that would be unlawful, but it is still quite hard for women, and especially young women, to kind of live with, is much less tolerated. And I would say, in general, you have much less reminders of your own gender when you're a woman scientist in the UK. That said, there's still some unacceptable behaviors, so sexual harassment still happens in the UK. You still have discrimination, and I don't know, again, talking about this post-Weinstein era, I don't know what you guys think, but I think academia is probably the next place where we hear about those kind of scandals, because some things are still kind of hidden, I'd say. Finally, just to talk on a kind of maybe more personal note, there's still a difficulty I find as an early career scientist, which is science can still kind of feel a bit like a gentleman's club. And in particular, although there are lots of things done in the institutions to help promote women in science, there is also always a kind of difficult balance I find between professionalism and friendliness. And in particular, that's actually something that I haven't invented, but I saw on Facebook on a male colleague that posted that on Facebook. He talked about his scientific bromance with another colleague. And I think that's kind of something that I find quite difficult to tackle, in the sense that the problem is that if you have a lot of professionalism and things that are very institutionalized to protect women in science, there still remains the question of, your day-to-day experience is that usually you're quite friendly with people in the lab. And if it's still harder for women and men to have this kind of personal relationship in the workplace, it also makes it harder for women to kind of have the positive sides of this relationship benefit them, such as informal mentoring or collaborations that come not from sending an email to someone around the globe, but just going to the pub after a day of work and just having a few beers and thinking that you're having the best idea for the next experiment. So if this is still not available the same way to women, then that's something that can still be difficult in the progression of their career. So that's it for what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Great talk, Lucie. So I'm going to tell you a bit about my experience as a woman in science a bit later in the career. So, I'll start with a little story way back in '94 when I was doing my postdoc in London. I was sharing an office with Virginia Valian, who is a psycholinguist, but she also has a second life. She studies gender differences overall, not just in science. And she was telling me, about the glass ceiling, all these things, pay differences. And I had no idea at the time that it existed, but my first reaction was, oh, these poor women in the United States, life must be really hard for them. But in France, we're much better. We don't do these things because we have this system of concours and it's fully anonymized and everything, so we don't have this problem. Well, a few years later, I saw the stats from Cnrs when they started to come out, and I knew that she was right. The problem is everywhere. And so then I got confronted to this idea that people have expectations, right? So you expect an old man, right, as a scientist, let's say it. And so in 2000, for the new millennium, the state had organized this big series of conferences. It was called Université de tous les savoirs, so University of All Knowledge. And first they asked my boss to give a talk on language acquisition, that was Jacques Meller, and he never replied, so since he hadn't replied, they asked me instead, and I was about 33 at the time. And so I said, yes, okay, I'll go. So I prepared a lot. This was a huge talk. I had never given something like that. I was very impressed, and I did my best, and I even thought, well, I can't possibly go dressed like this, so I went to buy myself a new suit. I took a PhD student with me who had a better fashion sense. And so I got there with my new suit half an hour early at this place. And there was a long queue of people coming to listen to me. Okay, so I was even more impressed. So I jumped the whole queue. I took to this woman in the cubicle, and I say, oh, I'm coming for the conference. And she said to me, oh, bonjour, mademoiselle. Well, please join the queue. And I had to say, oh, I'm talking today. So she said, okay. So go ahead, like second door on the left. So I get to this huge amphitheater. I had never seen one that big. And I start going down the steps, one by one. And there was a couple of technicians down there who were organizing the mics. And they look at me and they wonder what I'm doing here, right? And they say, oh, bonjour, mademoiselle, again. Well, you should sit around here. That's a very good place to see. If you come further down, then you'll have a crick in your neck. You'll have to look at this won't work. Okay. So, and again, I had to say, oh, but I'm talking today. So they were expecting the talker, of course, to come about half an hour early. But a young woman was not a possible talker. It had to be an old guy. Okay. So that's how ingrained our expectations are. And I was the same. So about that same moment, I had a young child, who had convulsions while he was at the nursery. He went to the hospital, so I was there. I was really worried, and I was waiting to see the doctor. And then a young woman arrives and starts talking to me. And it took me a few moments to read her name tag and realize that was the doctor. So I was also expecting an old guy as a doctor, right? A young woman was another nurse. So we have these biases, and they're everywhere, and we're not conscious of them. Okay. And then now, much more recently, like maybe 1 or 2 years ago, I thought, okay, we have ways of measuring these things. So maybe you've heard about the implicit association test. It's something you can run on the internet. They have it on gender, on race, everything. So the idea is really simple. They tell you all you have to do, you read this word, and then you classify it left or right. So you start, and if it's a word linked to a woman, like sister or aunt, or if it's a word linked to housework, then you click on the right button. If it's a word linked to men or to science, then you click on the left button. Okay, so that's easy enough. You do this for a little while. And then they say, now we change the rules. Now if women and science go right, and men and housework go left. And they expect you to be slower the second time. And of course I thought, well, I'm not biased against women in science, right? I am a woman in science. I've been fighting for women in science, so I know where I'm. But the test said I was biased too. So I wasn't ready to buy this. I struggled a bit. I didn't like that one bit. So I said, okay, of course, this is cheated because I first learned one association and then they made me switch. So there is a cost to switching. So that's why I'm slower the second time. So I went on the website and I read all the information, and they said, of course, there are switch costs, but trust us, we did all the counterbalancing, everything, and still there remain some bias. So I had to admit it. I probably am biased too, unconsciously, even though consciously I'm doing my best to be perfectly equal towards men and women. Okay, another thing I wanted to talk about is this problem of social pressure. So not just against women in science, but now against working moms. So it's not always easy to balance your family life and your work life, and it's harder on women than on men, as we heard in the beginning, in the introduction. And so again, I had that experience when I was a young female scientist and expecting my first child. And at that time, I was doing a postdoc in London. And I have to say that I felt the social pressure much stronger in London than in France against working mums. So I had just got that position into Cnrs, and people were congratulating me. You know, it's a lifelong position, and I can be a research-only person for my whole life. So I was so thrilled. And then when people realized I was pregnant, they started telling me, so not the academics, but like the baby lab secretaries, people like that who were not directly working in research, they would tell me, oh, now that you're pregnant, you're going to stop working. And I thought, wow, something wasn't clear there. I didn't make. So I explained again. I said, oh, you know, this is a lifelong research position that I got in France. I don't want to get rid of that. You know, I said, oh, but you have a baby now, you know. You should stop working. So the pressure was really strong to stop. And then I spent a few months in Germany, and it was even worse. So there it was just plain impossible to find babysitting for my baby, because why would I not stay at home with him and take care of him, you know? So this was really worse. So that's a problem that people have to face. I think it's getting better now, but it still depends a lot on countries. And it's not just the idea that it's okay for a mom to be working and you don't make her feeling guilty because she is working. It's also the question of, do you get support from the society? And so again, at least at the time in London, if you wanted to hire a nanny, that was just not possible because it was a Mary Poppins style nanny, you know, the really fully fledged nanny. She was making more money than me. You know, how can you possibly pay a nanny? This was not possible. And the day nurseries, they were not enough. They were really expensive, so that was another problem. My parents had to subsidize me so that I could pay for the day nursery and for my rent. Okay. So what can we do about that? Social pressure and helping women? I guess in that case, just talking. So being flexible about times of meetings, talking with people about their experience, so asking them. So if I'm supervising a woman, or if I just chat with a woman, I will ask them, okay, and what do? Do you have a partner? Do you have children? How do you handle these things? And just talk about this, share experience, and show them it's okay to talk about these things also at work. I mean, it's not like you have a private life and a professional life and they don't talk together. It's okay to handle the whole thing together. And maybe the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly is this idea that women tend to undervalue themselves. And so I had a first bit of information there, again, back in London, 94. So I was working in the same lab as Aude, who is really a very extraordinary woman. She became well known for her work on dyslexia and autism. And she's German. At the time, she was the only female student in her high school, because she went to a scientific high school and female were not supposed to go there, right? They were supposed to go to the other high school where they were learning how to sew and not how to make science. And so when I told her, oh, I got this job at Cnrs, she told me with her German accent, well done, good for you, but that's not enough. Now you have to become head of your lab. And so, and I did. That was her attitude, okay? She said women have to be ambitious, because they won't think about it spontaneously. So you have to push them all the time to think really high, to aim high. That's her idea. And yeah, I guess I'll close on this one. So just again, mentoring, helping people to think high. Oh yes, one thing, how do you practically not undervalue yourself? It's not that easy, in fact, because you start double-guessing yourself. Okay, so you think, oh, I know I shouldn't undervalue myself. So if I think I'm not good enough for this grant now, like let's say, I don't know, starting ERC position now for Naomi, is she ready for that? She might think, oh, maybe I think I'm not ready, but that's because I'm undervaluing myself, right? But it's really not easy to know when you are valuing yourself at your exact value. So my advice would be just ask a lot of people. So aim high. Then ask people, is that within my reach now? Because, of course, if you start applying to many things that you cannot possibly achieve, then you lose too much time. So ask people, if you don't know anybody who knows somebody in the panel who can tell you, they ask again. I mean, you will find somebody who knows. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we open this to discussion, I just want to say one thing, because I have been talking to a few women here in the UNS before we started, And there was one point they wanted to also bring across, which is a positive one. So for all the women here that chose to be in the academia or that are thinking about it, you should also know that sometimes this is much harder in the private sector. So women who have been working in the private sector have also said that they have felt relief coming here. Also seeing men come with their babies here. And just the flexibility of working in the academia. So being able to push around some classes or to miss work for a week when your kid is in the hospital and then make up for it in weekends or in the summer. So there's actually also very positive things about this choice of career. For women, also for dads. Yeah, so C will run the discussion with the audience.
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I was just curious if there is any empirical evidence of hiring bias against women in the CNRS. So relative to the number of applications, is there sort of an underrepresentation of women, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so these are stats that they look at very regularly, but they do it at the level of each. I mean, these are very small numbers, so it's always hard to decide. They try to keep it balanced and they look at it, but it might still be a little bit below.
Okay, so that would be if like 40% of the applicants were women, then
maybe
the people who would get the jobs,
35% get in.
I think it would be interesting to look at both the entry level and the director level. My very sort of qualitative impression, at least looking at and there's also some data from it looking at the American system, is that in some disciplines there actually tends to be a hiring bias in favor of women at the entry level. But then there's not a lot of good data for the sort of what would be the equivalent of the DER in France. So if someone were to go out and study this stuff, that would be the type of data I would be really curious to see.
Oh, all that is available. So Cnrs publishes this every year by everything you want to cut it across. Yes, and it's true that at the highest level of the hierarchy, you have very few women. So DER class exceptionnelle, you don't have many, especially in math, but also in others.
Yeah, those stats can be looked at in this report from 2016 of the Mission pour la place des femmes. By implementing that, they've actually been very actively trying to consider these things, namely what you were mentioning, relative to the number of applicants, whether there is a disadvantage. And they show it, but of course it does vary across fields. And yes, I wanted to mention earlier that we insisted philosophers should come, because even though this issue of inequalities is a lot discussed in sciences, and normally in the humanities, women are even often overrepresented. Philosophy tends to be an exception, where women sometimes are at the levels that you might see in physics and maths. So I'm glad some of them did come. Any more questions?
And also to answer to you, Brent, I went to a brain hack a few weeks ago at the ICM. And there was a woman doing that chose to do a presentation about women in science. And there was this one from the ICM that works on gender equality. And they showed us data that, when you're a PhD, there are more women than men in the ICM. And then postdoc also. And when you start to go for first for chargé de recherche, it switch off. And then when you go even higher, directeur de recherche and everything, it gets really big difference. So it's always small numbers, but if you look at just the size of this institution, so there is data, and also I think I saw, I don't know, remember where, but that for the CNRS, women have to publish I think it's 16 publications to get the first job, and then for men it's 12 or something like this in average. Yeah.
Okay, so I have one, actually. So it's actually a question for all of you. You've all been talking kind of about also being the change, because if we don't see a lot of us in a lot of places, a lot of women, we actually have not only the job of getting into higher places ourselves, progressing with our careers, but also there is this issue that we always want, all of you, I think, have been trying to be role models and mentors for other women. And that's time-consuming. So I was wondering whether you have a solution to that. what do you think should be done in order for women to have enough time to advance their careers, but also to allow this modeling at the same time?
So maybe I can say a word on that, and I think Aude as well. So the mission that I did when I was doing my PhD was actually paid. So it was a mission of democratization in science, and I was paid to do it. And I think when you're doing a PhD, you don't really have any spare time to do this kind of thing. And I think the fact that in this case the institution kind of agreed to pay students to do this democratization of science, and in particular on this question of women in science, is definitely a possibility. And I think that's where I think institutions have to kind of step in and create this kind of a context for women to do that, so that it is rewarded at some level. I think, as I was talking about the Athena Swan movement, one thing is, again, kind of advertise this as a positive experience. So meaning that universities who do this kind of thing are also kind of branded and advertised as kind of better universities. So I think it's harder at the individual level, I would say, to do that, but I think if we have people at the level of the institutions that are in favor of these things, then there can be opportunities and there can be kind of encouragement for women to kind of help themselves and help their colleague, I would say.
Yeah, I totally agree. When I was talking earlier about the high school students that came to my lab, it was actually part of a formation doctorale. So it was agreed by my university, and it counted as 30 hours of formation doctorale. So I first had like a class about scientific mediation to see how I can interact with them and make them understand science. So actually I was learning stuff for myself, and then they really gave value to what I did through the doctoral formation doctorale. About what I do with the For Girls in Science program, it's totally volunteer, and I don't get any credits for that. I mean, for around the formation doctorale, but it's actually quite nice to do. And I mean, people are volunteering for a lot of causes, and so if you like what you're doing, it doesn't really count as a waste of time or whatever. It's just meeting new people and sharing your ideas. It's actually quite nice. And I sometimes do that during my working time, because if I want to see a class, it's during the day, during the week, obviously. But my research directors totally accept that I leave for half a day if it's for that, because they understand why it's important for me, and they actually are really supportive of this. So I think two things. The first thing is just, as you said, that the institutions should encourage it. And the second thing is just, when you were talking about advertising, I think we should also advertise it to other women, because if you are a lot of women doing this, that we don't need so much time, each one of us doesn't need to use so much time. So yeah, if you are a lot of girls doing that, it's just a very, very small amount of time for everyone.
Is it ever valued when you apply for grants, that you've done this kind of promoting the place of women? Apparently it's valued in the PhD programs, but then when you apply for grants, is it a good thing that you've done this kind of thing? I guess outreach is valued, so maybe. Yeah, that's it.
I will give it to Anne, but for the L'Oréal prize, actually, they also take this into account. So yeah.
Yes. So just as you say, anything having to do with outreach towards society would help a bit, but definitely, I mean, the quality of your project and your publication list are the two most important things for that.
I think, so to add on for the UK, that's major. So now everyone says that when you're writing a grant, the outreach part needs to be as strong as the scientific part, almost, because the government has very strict policy on what they are funding, and they really want to see results that are just scientific results. But so I've been told, I mean, I'm not in many committees for grants, I've been told that this is really important, and that would definitely count, I think.
Is it working? Yeah. I have the reverse question. Like, can it desservir? How do you say that? Can it detrimental you to do some things for women in science? Because, for example, here we're doing nice things, but being a feminist can be a lot harder and harsher and more political. And if you get into this stuff, can it deserve you?
I have no idea. Definitely the kind of thing we're doing now can never hurt you. I never met a case of like an application where this was counted against somebody. But I have to say that I don't see that very much in applications. Like I have rarely seen in application people saying, I do something for women in science in particular.
Yeah, I can add on that. When we were trying to find people around here in France, it was really difficult to find people who mentioned, for example, in their CV, women that mentioned that they were engaged in these kinds of topics. And maybe they are, but we just don't know. So this is definitely something about making it more visible, that people are engaged in this, which then helps other people know this is happening. And it helps, again, to create these kinds of support networks and peer networks.
So if I can add on that, I think one thing that is still difficult and probably, that's what I mentioned in my talk. So I think we are in this post-Weinstein world now, and I think we know, we still know that there are some people in power that are abusing their position in academia, and I think that would be probably something in which being. I would recommend to be outspoken, but I think people need to be careful on how they kind of lead this action and kind of potentially, publicly talk about the behaviors of these men. So that's something that I would say is still where we all know, and we have heard stories of things in which situations that were tough. But I do believe things are changing. It's really interesting to hear you talk about how the UK were in the 80s, and now I think things are changing for the better. And so, yeah, I would say I would definitely encourage women to do that, and men as well, to kind of position themselves. And I don't think any bad can come of it for your career.
Yeah, from my very small experience of just a PhD student until now, like I only had very, very good consequences of being engaged. I actually wrote it on my resume, and when you show that you really have strong ideas and you are willing to defend them, I think it's always good, whatever the subject is, if it's socially accepted. It only shows that you have character and you really believe in something and you want to fight for it. For me, I don't think it had any bad consequences until now.
But women of character are not always really welcome everywhere, And also, if you're doing things in a high school, for example, but if you start doing things in your lab, and for example, you're a student, and for example, I'm involved in mediation between students and their supervisors. And if it gets difficult, it might end up being bad for me, for my career, for the people I know, because I'm going to get involved in things that are not pretty for the people that might hire me one day. So I think it's still difficult. It's not that easy and as pretty as just a good line on a resume and also all the good things you can do in high schools or whatever. Like if you get in your institution, it's more difficult.
Yeah, actually, I guess it's as a risk. I just myself didn't encounter it right now. But yeah, obviously, when you are really you have a strong character, you always have people that disagree with you, and it may hurt. But well.
So I have to say I agree with you, and I think it can be a problem, and in particular because I agree with you. If you go speak to high school students, you don't. It's not the same thing than talking to your colleagues and denouncing some situations. Or I'd say that's probably where the positive I see is when then men who are in position of power, so professors, do support women in these kind of situations. And I have to say, I encountered men that really positively try to make the situation better for young women and kind of supporting them in this kind of potentially difficult situation. So that's maybe where the hope is, or there's something to be done. But I completely agree with you. In some situation, it is difficult, and unfortunately, I think it will remain for some time.
About this question, because when I got to the lab, I said very quietly, "Oh, I'm a bit feminist, na na na." And it's very hard to talk about it with people you work with. And because, okay, they agree, there's the Cnrs, data, everything, but it's getting better. And here, there's no problem. There's never any problem around you. Even if you feel there are, people around you will say, no, here, we live a happy life, we are at ENS, everything is good. So I feel it's very hard to talk about it when you come across problems around you and that touch people you talk to every day. And it's easy, it's always easy in feminism to say, oh, women must be better, they must have better self-confidence, everything. But when you started criticizing, for example, the committee or how people are funded or how people are treated in the lab, and if there is a bias, women don't feel as nicely as men, for example, or you can find many situations, then it can get ugly, and you can start fighting with people. And this is not what you want when you enter. I'm a PhD student, so when you enter a lab, you are not the stronger voice, so you try to make your ideas, put your ideas on the table, but you cannot decide everything. And I feel this is a problem, and I would like to know if you have experienced that, and if you know, little tools or toolboxes or things that can help to start this conversation with the colleagues, and maybe help making biases evident for everyone, a bit like the online test you talked about. And I would like to know if somebody experienced that. Thank you.
But what really helped was a website called Fac. I don't know if you know this. So it's a website with a lot of testimonies of sexism and how women, what they can hear in the universities or in higher education places, and it's anonymous, so anyone can just write what they heard, and then people are like, oh wow, is it really true? When you're a girl, you really hear this kind of stuff, and then you can really begin talking. Because I think the problem is when you talk about your own experience, people always think that you're exaggerating, that you are too much emotionally involved to be objective or stuff like that. But if it's more anonymous data, I guess it's easier to talk about it. And even if it's you who wrote the testimony, they don't have to know. So, I will really advise you to just show this website and then show maybe TED Talks or other conversations that are started on the internet and that are more, far away from you. That's not really your direct experience. But I think it's easier like that.
Well, even if you want to change things in your lab and you think there are biases, I would say brands answer the best one. So you go for facts. If you think there are biases, then you just gather facts. You say, okay, so there were, I don't know, so many master students, and this was the proportion of the women before, and this is the proportion of women after getting the PhD grant. Or, anywhere where you think there might be a bias, you can just gather numbers. So when numbers are very small, it's hard to tell. That's what I was saying in part, but you can gather them over several years or go higher or move to the whole Cnrs or stuff like that. So I think we are all scientists. People are ready to get convinced by facts.
Yeah, and if I can add as well on that, I think the other thing, for example, to help reduce the costs, the personal costs of trying to promote these things in your own labs and so on. I think that's where institutions are really critical. So action at an institutional level, and also women coming together and organized to promote these kinds of events or promote talks that actually discuss the stats and facts and studies that have been done on this issue, again, are just ways to sort of distribute the pressure, the personal pressure that people have. And I really think it's the networks of people are what makes a difference. So that's what we hope to create here and get you signed up.
So, but sometimes you also have a specific problem with a specific individual, and it might, I don't know.
No, just point.
There we go. Okay, so, you might want to talk to somebody about that, preferably confidentially. Is there anything at the deck now where you can do that? Because there are just complicated relationships. The person might be in a position of responsibility over you, and then you can't just go about telling everybody about your conflict, because that might affect you adversely. So in those cases, it helps if there is like a procedure available, some kind of, some kind of negotiation can be set up, and somebody you can talk to confidentially. So does that exist at the deck? And
yeah, I agree. It's very needed. So we discussed that a few months back, and since then we have a mediator, a couple of mediators actually, but they're supposed to handle mostly a relationship between PhD students and supervisors. So we don't have a general one. So Salvador Mascareñas, together with Lorna, who is sitting just behind you, and he's a PhD student now. So yes, I think at the ENS level it would be nice if we had a mediator for other kinds of situation. I don't know, like between colleagues or between head of department and other colleagues. So situations not involving PhD students specifically. And to answer the other question, the one that was just asked a while ago by you, we also have Anne-Françoise Benamou, who is référente parité at the UNS. And so if you have a feeling that in your, very locally, where you live, in your lab, there are some things that don't go right, well, there is this person you can go and talk to. She's sitting right here. and even though, so the UNS is a very small place. So compared to UCL, it's not the case that you have all these procedures and stuff like that. But the direction is very open to all of these kinds of initiatives. So if you have ideas, preferably positive ideas, concrete ideas about how to improve things, I'm sure they're very ready to support any suggestions we have. So yes, that would be my hope from something like this, that people come up with suggestions as to how to improve things. And I'm sure Anne-Françoise would be very happy to have concrete suggestions about what should be done at the UNS level to improve the life of people in general. Or maybe put in place a mentoring program, that kind of thing, that could easily be done if we have a bit like concrete ideas from people who've seen it work elsewhere about how to go about this.
Thanks for this discussion so far. So for me, it seems that this gender gap is stronger at leadership positions, basically. And so for me, it seems to be that it's also related to how we consider what is a good leader, what are the qualities that are required for that. It goes to me because I did a mentoring program, so I worked in the Netherlands for some time, and I followed the mentoring program for women. And there they say to me, like for instance, that the NVO, which is the institution that provides grants there, has very explicit guidelines to what they expect as a good candidate for these grants. And among the qualities were, so what was stated was like the candidate needs to be confident, it needs to be also has individualistic behavior, and also be some sort of like weird qualities like charisma, you know. So for me, there seems to be like qualities that are not inherently considered as masculine, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, so it felt weird to me because I had the belief that people expected me to become this old white male scientist to become successful. So, and I do believe that qualities that are inherently feminine are also very valuable to become as a leader. So I was thinking, what can we do for that? How can we praise also more feminine qualities for this type of positions?
Yeah, so I fully agree. That's not a problem just in academia, where it's probably a bit less bad than elsewhere. It's a problem in general. Like, I don't know, there's this... I've just been invited to one of these mentoring programs to push women to become directors in the enseignement supérieur. So the French state is also trying to do things. It's not easy to change the whole society, the way, like she's saying it in high schools, but the Mission pour la place des femmes, which started, I think, in 2000, you look at the numbers in 2000, you look at the numbers today, they haven't changed one iota. Okay, so they've been trying for 18 years, and it doesn't change much. So we know it's very difficult to change people's minds. And in fact, my hope would be that you've heard about the new things that they do in social cognition, the nudges, you know, how to get people to change their behavior just by giving them a slight indication that they could go in that direction. Maybe we should think about these things when we want to change the way in which society as a whole thinks of leaders. Like, as you said, it would be nice to have more leaders with feminine qualities too. But I should say again, that's something Naomi said briefly. Academia is a really good field to be a woman in, because you have large flexibility of hours, and also because there is, in my experience, almost no overt machismo behaviors, not in academia, and definitely not here. I never had any sexist remark. So if there are biases, and I know there are, and I know that even I am biased, right? They're there, but fully unconscious. So at least we live in a world where people respect you for what you are. So that's a blessing. We need to stop, I think.
Thanks, everyone.
And sorry. I also really wanted to thank the DEC Life and the DEC for funding this event, and our food and the recording. And thank you all for coming.